Hello and welcome. This is Gazette Plus podcast. I'm Worku Belachew. Today I'm joined by Dr. Lawrence Freeman, who is a political economic analyst. He has been into it for over 35 years. Today we'll be delving into the Red Sea dynamics. Ethiopia is reasserting its historical, legal, and economic rights to access the Red Sea. On one hand, there are countries that are supporting this move, saying that Ethiopia's regaining access to the Red Sea would unlock benefits for the Horn of Africa and the entire region. On the other hand, there are some quarters who see the matter with green eye. Would Ethiopia's coming back to the Red Sea bring trouble for the Horn of Africa? Or is it a blessing? We'll be delving into it with Dr. Lawrence Freeman. Stay tuned. Thank you so much, Dr. Lawrence Freeman, for this interview just now to dedicate your dear time for interview with Gazette Plus. Having said that, let's start our interview with your belief. You believe that economic development is an essential human right. Could you give us a little bit insight into it?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. The question that I deal with all the time is that people, so-called analysts and leaders of other countries, ignore the fundamental principle of foreign policy, which is the development of the human being. That is, we have to satisfy the material standards of living for people in terms of electricity, housing, job opportunities, education. And we have to satisfy those needs so we can develop the potential of the mind, the creativity of each individual. Now, many people ignore this completely. And they say, no, we have to impose democracy. We have to impose good governance. We have to impose this or that lifestyle, this or that agreement with others. And my point is, no, you have to realize that economic development is the most important human right. And if we don't satisfy that right to live and to live a productive, meaningful life, then none of the other policies that we're advocating are going to work. They're all going to fail. And they're a waste of time unless we develop this economic growth of the human being, which requires infrastructure and many other factors to make that happen.
There are some entities that impede development in regions, particularly when we come to Africa. So, what do you call these entities? How do you understand them?
Well, what you have is the financial political elites of the Western nations and their institutions and their financial institutions and their think tanks. They have now identified themselves as the rules-based international order. And their outlook is completely detrimental because they believe that the world is fixed and that there's a zero-sum game and that the goal of the Western nations is to be hegemonic means you have to be number one. You have to be on top and everybody else, other nations have to be below you. Therefore, they look at every part of the world from this lens, the zero-sum mentality lens, and therefore they just see the world, like Africa, as pieces, pawns on a chessboard. How do we move this country? How do we control that country? How do we counter China? And this is all part of their ideology, which is failing. It's coming apart because you're seeing a growth of the global south, of BRICS and other institutions. So therefore, their view doesn't have a view of development. It has a view of manipulation. The rules-based order wants to control, wants to impose, wants to dictate, but they don't want to be partners in development. And that's why you see the West has done nothing for 60 years in building and contributing to the improvement of infrastructure in Africa. China has, other countries have, Turkey has, but the Western nations refuse. They've lost the conception of development and how to achieve economic growth. And our country domestically has lost the same conception in the United States. So they're not helpful to any situation. They don't want to promote independent economic sovereignty. And you can see that in the relations that exist between the West and Ethiopia. Ethiopia had this tremendous accomplishment of building the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which I visited twice. And rather than being praised and supported, there was only one voice of support that I was able to see coming from the West. Otherwise, people didn't even want to understand that the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, is the most important development on the Sub-Saharan continent since the liberation wars from colonialism in the 1960s.
Yeah, when it comes to impeding development, often we just point fingers to the global north. But still, there are some entities, even African entities, African elements that involve in zero-sum game, zero-sum machinations. So how did you understand them? Still African entities, but they involve in a zero-sum politics.
Well, we have a good one example of that is the unfortunate policy that Egypt has towards Ethiopia. Now, there are many things going on in Egypt by the current president El-Sisi, which are positive. But unfortunately, the government leadership of Egypt has adopted the policy of the rules-based order and zero sum. So rather than seeing the potential for joint cooperative development of the Nile Basin and all the nations in the Nile Basin, they falsely view Ethiopia as an enemy. And they've been conducting policy in the Horn of Africa that is counterproductive and represents the same zero-sum mentality I was talking about. We either have to be stronger in Ethiopia or we're going to be weaker in Ethiopia. And they've had this development now since, I guess, around 1903. They've had this conception that Ethiopia has to be contained. And that's why they oppose any development of dams in the Blue Nile Basin. The GERD is just the first one. It's a hydroelectric dam, and it's a complete pass-through. None of the water is retained. In fact, it's right there at the border of Sudan. So you can't even divert the water. It's going to flow directly into the Nile, from the Blue Nile into the Nile in Sudan. And therefore, there's no harm, zero harm. And this has been documented during the 5 years of the filling of the dam. Yet Egypt maintains that this is harmful to them. And it's not because it is harmful, it's because of their geopolitical mentality that they adopted from the British when the British controlled them for about a century or two. So this is the problem. And we see it, yes, it exists in other countries as well. We've lost a common notion that how countries can cooperate together for the common interest of mankind. And this does not exist. This is not understood by various governments and leaders. And for me, it's very clear that this is the way to achieve peace, stability, and prosperity, is by cooperation, not building up really phony antagonisms that don't really exist.
Do you think that Egypt can contain Ethiopia?
I don't think you're going to, I think even that question is the problem. You're not going to, the idea of trying to contain another country is a disease of the rules-based order. Why do we want countries to think like the West when the West is failing in this new multipolar world? Containing another country is what the United States is using Africa to contain China. I don't want to contain countries. I want to see countries grow and develop and expand and develop the potential of the creativity of the population. Containment is failed policy, and it should be rejected. And in fact, we should pass a law. We can't talk about containing any country. That's no longer allowed to be spoken of. We can only talk about cooperation and development of other countries.
Okay, I'll come back to Egyptian policy later, or just during our discussion. So many countries that are establishing that have actually already established bases, naval bases, to protect their so-called interest along the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and Arabian Sea. We can take Camp Lemonnier of the United States, also Japan and China. Even Chinese presence is actually it's the first overseas presence in the Horn of Africa. So Ethiopia, in Djibouti, sure, yeah. So we are 60 kilometers away from the Red Sea, and historically, and we also claim legally and economically, we have got interest on the Red Sea. Some see Ethiopia's Ethiopia's attempt, Ethiopia's quest to regain Red Sea access as a threat. Some see it as a benefit. What's your insight on this?
The whole situation is complicated by the legacy of colonialism in Africa and the Horn of Africa. Now, Ethiopia is distinguished by never having been colonized, and that is one of the positive features that I believe motivates some of the Ethiopian policy. But you've had every other country except Liberia been colonized. So these countries were under colonialism. You had the British controlling parts of Somalia with the British protectorate. You had the Italians controlling certain areas. Then these areas became independent at a certain point. Then they merged together. And essentially, the borders were never decided by African nations. They are an extension of the colonialism that came from the Colonial Conference of November 1884 to February 1885. So there was never a conscious African conception of borders. So as a result of the 1993 independence, the government at that time, headed by Meles Zenawi, for reasons that I can speculate on, enabled the Eritreans to have the port of Assab, for example. What we can do is we can get cooperation between Ethiopia and Eritrea, for example, and the same thing can be done with Somalia, for cooperation on port access to the Red Sea. And that port would obviously lead to economic revenues coming in to the countries. If we have Barbara in Somaliland or Assab in Eritrea or other potential ports, those countries would gain economic revenue from the involvement of Ethiopia expanding its port. Right now, Ethiopia spends over $1.5 billion in what's called foreign exchange, not Ethiopian currency, to use the port of Djibouti. So there's no reason they should be limited to that. In fact, my view is that Ethiopia, as a growing economy of 130 million people, should have multiple ports, and therefore you would have a naval military bases to protect your interests. So we have to overcome the friction. And the way to overcome the friction is to have a vision of the future. Where do we want to be in 20 years, one generation or two generations? How do we uplift the economic, how do we uplift the population of Ethiopia, of Eritrea, of Somalia, of Somaliland? How do we improve the standard of living of these people? When you're dealing with a few 100 million people, how do we eliminate poverty, which plagues all these countries, including Ethiopia? So those are the questions. What kind of economic cooperation, mutual integration can we all participate in? And if we still have antagonism or prejudices left over from the previous period, then hopefully uh, these prejudices will begin to disappear over time as each country sees that it's in the self-interest of themselves to cooperate with the other. This is a little-known conception in the history of mankind. The benefit of the other is a benefit to thyself. And we have to get that level of thinking we have to get the leaders of these countries committed to that concept.
Yeah, regarding cooperation, in a recent parliamentary session, Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed said he actually attempted with the government of Eritrea to develop a support, for instance. He said there was a port, there were houses and so on, but the infrastructure was aging. So it was actually the attempt was to change that infrastructure, to develop it and just to put it for a win-win purpose. But the Eritrean government was not willing. Why do you think is the Eritrean government avoiding this opportunity?
Well, there's many, uh, as I said, they're all historical reasons. And I don't know the conversations or the inner thinking of Prime Minister Abiy. I've never met him. But the fact of the matter is, the only way you change things positively is you're going to have to use the power of persuasion. You have to find ways to promote and win people over to what is in their interest. Now, you had the agreement in 2018 between the two leaders of Eritrea and Ethiopia. And they actually signed an agreement. And part of that 2018 agreement,
You mean the cessation of hostilities agreement?
sorry,
You mean the cessation of hostilities agreement?
well, but in that agreement, they had a paragraph calling for economic cooperation and economic regional integration. So that, which they wrote, the two leaders, so that is the starting point. Now that got unfortunately undone by the results of the war, which ended in 2022 with the Pretoria Peace Agreement, and things have gone unraveled since then. But we do have the two leaders agreeing to the kind of cooperation I'm suggesting 7 years ago. And we have to find a way to get back to that conception. And it means that there's going to be compromises because people are going to see that economic cooperation, lifting up millions of people in the Horn of Africa, how to come to a conclusion that that's the direction that we're going to cooperate with.
Major powers from faraway countries are establishing their bases along the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. But what do you think would Ethiopia's regaining access would add to peace and prosperity of the region?
Well, I don't. I don't think there's a problem, but obviously other countries do. And as I identified a few minutes ago, there are colonial historical legacies. And those things are complicating the situation. And therefore, it's up to people who believe, like I do, in the power of reason, to use reason to win people over to a perspective that's in the interest of all nations involved in a win-win situation. And if I take Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed at his word, this year he said several times, we're going to pursue this policy through peaceful negotiations. And I've heard other comments from other people, but he's the prime minister. And he says we're going to pursue it through peaceful negotiations. So I assume that's what's going to happen.
One of the problems along development issues in the Horn of Africa, particularly when it involves Ethiopia, is the Egyptian, involvement, particularly their policies towards Ethiopia is very daunting. So even now, when Ethiopia attempts to regain access along the Red Sea, they are trying just to interfere just by making alliance with some of the coastal countries along the Horn of Africa. So how could this be dealt with, in your opinion?
And they're doing it foolishly and recklessly. They're meddling in the Horn of Africa, and their efforts are counterproductive and could lead to confrontation. We saw for a period of about 10 years since Ethiopia started construction of the dam, like 2011. I think the first brick was laid on the GERD by Meles anyway. And the whole time, the Egyptians have opposed the development of the GERD, even though it's been known since the 1960s when the U.S. American survey team went into the Blue Nile Basin that there is enormous potential from the basin, fed by Lake Tana and other water sources, for economic development, including agriculture. This dam was the most effective in terms of providing hydroelectric power. So this has been known since the 1960s when Emperor Haile Selassie asked for help around the world to build this dam. It just took longer than he thought. The Egyptians have always have seen, and again, this is the inculcation of the Egyptian leadership of the rule-based order and the British mentality, since they were given the Nile as a colonial vassal of the British Queen in the early 1900s. And unfortunately, they are imbued with this deficient, what I call disease ideology of zero-sum game. And there's no excuse for it. And unlike countries in the Horn, which need to work things out among themselves as sovereign nations, uh, Egypt's intervention is totally outside of the Horn and is very provocative, counterproductive, and they should cut it out. And this has been going on now for over a decade, and there has been no diminution of water to the Aswan Dam. There's been no reduction of the flow of water, and there will be no reduction except in extreme droughts. So the Egyptians are carrying on a geopolitical campaign against Ethiopia because they don't want to see Ethiopia's uh, development become the source of what they view as a rival economic power in the Nile Basin. Now, as I said earlier, I think the Egyptians are doing many good things, but on this particular issue, they're wrong, and I oppose what they're doing.
Ah, quite interesting. The Egyptians and Ethiopia, Egypt and Ethiopia actually share the same table at the BRICS platform.
Well, that's the good news, is that they are both members of the BRICS. There's 10 members of the BRICS now. In Ethiopia and Egypt are two of them. And they're the two most populated members of the BRICS of Africa. Now, Nigeria is a partner of the BRICS, and I assume shortly will become a member. So the fact that Ethiopia and Egypt are in the same grouping of the BRICS, and the BRICS, in my opinion, are the leadership of the global South, and in many ways led by China. This is a good thing, and this means there's an opportunity for discussion and to resolve some of these problems because they're in the same close global South organization. So I'm happy that they both are, and I think that this is just another platform where we can hopefully make progress because uh, a conflict in the Horn of Africa at this stage, with the economic conditions the way they are for most countries, would be catastrophic. It'd be horrific. And we have to prevent any kind, for any reason, a military conflict in the Horn. because only the African people would suffer.
Ethiopia is asking, I mean, its rights that anyone actually, even from faraway countries, is enjoying. So, what can the African Union in this regard? What could it play in just finding the right solution, like African solution for African challenges?
Well, the problem is, as you probably know, the African Union
Yeah.
is not the strongest organization. It's the only one that represents almost all the countries on the African continent. And they played a good role during the period that Egypt kept challenging the United Nations Security Council to intervene into this conflict. And it was always left to the African Union. And the African Union really didn't support this kind of intervention against the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Therefore, they played a positive role. What kind of strength they have in trying to bring their countries together for the kind of economic development that we should have, uh, that remains an open question. I've been working on many infrastructure projects in Africa, including in Nigeria, to refurbish the Lake Chad Basin. And I've met with people in Nigeria in September on this question.
Okay.
And unfortunately, there's not a lot of support for that infrastructure project either. So we have a shortage of we don't have enough leaders thinking in terms of the way I do of how do you promote physical economic wealth and wealth sharing and regional integration among nations. Like, for example, you have the Africa Free Trade, Continental Free Trade area, which is a good idea to promote trade between countries. But it's not going to work unless you have a massive expansion in the kilometers of railroads and expansion in energy. Now, the good news is that Ethiopia, for 2 years, has been exporting electricity to neighboring countries, Kenya, Djibouti, Sudan, and I think this year, Tanzania. So that's already an example of regional integration, and that should be expanded. And I think Ethiopia is playing a positive role. And I think also if they continue to improve their production of food, I think they're going to estimate to have 30 million tons of wheat this year produced and other food that they're working on. This also promotes regional integration by supplying necessary food to their own country and to neighboring countries. So the potential for common economic regional cooperation is already there. The question for leaders and thinkers is how do we expand it and use it to put to rest threats of military conflict, eliminate them. But you can't achieve these successes without eliminating poverty. And as long as you have massive poverty across Africa, you're not going to have stability, peace, or prosperity. So that's my focus. How do I, as a physical economist, win people over to ideas of physical economic growth?
Yeah. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is already completed, and it's actually generating electricity, supplying for neighboring countries. Egypt actually was just doing all at its disposal to stop the construction. What can Egyptian politicians learn from this? What can they learn, and how can they go forward?
Well, it's obvious to me that the Egyptian leadership should be meeting with the Ethiopian leadership and discussing how we can develop the whole Blue Nile Basin, the Nile Basin. Look, you've got about 10 countries that are considered part of the Nile Basin with populations that are going to reach 500 million people. over 200 million just between Egypt and Ethiopia. The Nile is not going to increase its water. It has a maximum volume of 84 billion cubic meters. They estimate 10 billion cubic meters are lost to evaporation. Therefore, there's only a limit to the Nile. My proposal is we have to have massive destruction of nuclear powered desalination. Take the salt out of the Mediterranean and other areas and build the equivalent of the second Nile in terms of billions of cubic meters of water. So I would propose a conference to be held in Addis Ababa, invite Egyptians, Ethiopians, all countries of the Horn, other countries in the Nile Basin, have presentations by economists who know what they're talking about, like me, engineers, hydrologists, and others, and discuss a massive development policy for the Nile Basin, of which Egypt and Ethiopia would be partners in.
Yeah,
Entitled this.
yeah. Actually, there is also the Nile River Basin Commission that's already established automatically as a result of the document already signed and ratified by 6 countries. But Egypt is not still willing to be part of it.
Well, that's the challenge you have in diplomacy, is you have to win over people who don't agree with you. That's the whole purpose of diplomacy, is to avoid conflict and use the power of ideas to persuade other people and elevate their thinking so they do understand the common self-interest of cooperation. If we didn't have that challenge, we wouldn't need thousands of diplomats around the world. That's their job. That's the job of government leaders. And if you are leading a government, then you have responsibility to think on this level and cooperate on this level. And otherwise, you're not fulfilling responsibility as a leader.
What do you recommend for leaders of actually the Horn of African countries? Because there is Somalia with coastal territories, Eritrea, and also other countries. When they have just a little bit of skirmishes or disputes with Ethiopia, they just run to Egypt. So would that be a solution? What's your recommendation?
I told you. I told you the solution is diplomatic policy, diplomatic dialogue that centers and focuses on what I call physical economy. How do we grow our economy? How much electricity do we need? How many railroads do we need? How many cement plants do we need? How many fertilizer plants do we need? How much irrigation pumps do we need and pipes? What kind of physical inputs we're going to put into the economy to drive up the productivity of our labor force to produce more wealth than we did in the previous economic cycle? How do we produce an increase in the surplus of wealth so that we can raise people's standard of living and also feed an expanding population? That's the fundamental basis of policy. Foreign policy, domestic policy, economic policy all starts for me from one standpoint, the development of the human being, and that is the criteria. How do we improve standard of living of people? The more people and the present population. And that has to be the cornerstone of serious diplomatic dialogue between leaders.
Given that Ethiopia regained its access to the Red Sea, what potential could this unlock for the Horn of Africa?
We've already discussed this. I've said that if Ethiopia's economy,
But particularly from actually, yeah, you have just explained it from economic perspective. How about from security perspective?
well, but the key to security is an economic perspective. That's the problem in people's thinking. Look, you've got this. I've been covered widely now in Nigeria over the last few days because I'm opposing Trump's threats against Nigeria, a country I know longer than Ethiopia. And I've met with the military, and they have a horrible security problem. with violent extremism, especially in Northeast. And the military admitted to me, we can't win through kinetic warfare. We can only win through development. So when you say to me, I'm only focusing on development, that is security. If you have hungry people in Eritrea and hungry people in Somalia, then those people can be manipulated because they're desperate. And desperate people are subject to desperate actions. And therefore, we can't change the world, we can't change even this area of these countries unless we eliminate that desperation. And that means physical economic growth. And people don't like hearing this from me, but I'm right. And the history of Africa proves I'm right. This is an area where not sufficient attention has been paid to or understood by various leaders. Some leaders have understood it. Kwame Nkrumah, if you read his early speeches, was very well understood this, and others have. But we don't have enough leaders understanding the importance of physical economy.
I agree with you that economic development is a key component of peace and security. But my point is that Ethiopia has got, as an anchor state in the east of Africa, it could provide, for instance, security. It has got experiences in peacekeeping. So, what would this experience, wheels of experience, contribute for the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and so on? If you have,
But we know that there are antagonisms because of previous military actions that involve the countries of the Horn of Africa. That's a fact. They occurred. And we know the effects of colonial legacy in manipulating, dividing up countries and joining them together. All this exists. So yes, the Ethiopians are experienced in security. They played a big part in the deployments into Sudan when I was there in Sudan. But we nevertheless cannot overlook these frictions which exist between countries. We can't pretend there haven't been wars. We can't pretend there haven't been past antagonism. To pretend there haven't been is silly. We have to say, yes, they have happened. We have all made mistakes. Now we have to figure out what do we do together that's in the interest of our nation, for the future of our nation and future generations.
mm, there are some naysayers who view that Ethiopia's quest would lead to kinetic war and so on. What's your message for such naysayers?
I said repeatedly, we have to win people over to a conception of the benefits of cooperation and the benefits of seeing the other, the interest of the other, the interest of the other. So you take the other country into your heart and you say, how do I help them? Because it will help me. And that's the kind of elevated thinking that we have to promote.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lawrence Freeman, just now for this interview with Gazette Plus. This afternoon, actually, in Ethiopia, this morning in your country. I really appreciate your insight that you have provided for us. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Hope to see you again.
All right. Thank you. Bye bye.